World War II, beginning in 1939, plunged the world into a brutal conflict unlike any before. Fueled by Adolf Hitler's ambition, Nazi Germany swept across Europe with alarming speed, occupying nation after nation under the banner of the Third Reich. Poland fell first, followed by France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and beyond. For millions, occupation meant not just foreign rule, but a life under constant fear, oppressive laws, censorship, and violent crackdowns. Minority communities, especially Jews and Slavs, were singled out for persecution, deportation, and extermination in a campaign of terror that would come to define the Holocaust. Yet, in the shadows of tyranny, resistance began to grow. Brave individuals and underground networks fought back, risking everything for freedom. Among these courageous souls were young partisans, teenagers who defied one of history's darkest regimes. Their stories remind us that even in times of terror, hope and defiance can still rise. In the quiet hills of northwestern Bosnia, under the soft light of a winter sky, Lipa Radic was born on December 19, 1925, into a modest Bosnian Serb family. Her village, near Bosanska Gradiška, was far from the world's great cities. But even in this secluded corner of Yugoslavia, the echoes of political unrest rumbled in the distance. Lepa grew up surrounded by strong voices. Her family was deeply rooted in communist ideals, and her uncle, a known activist, filled their home with fiery debates about justice, freedom, and the future of their country. These conversations shaped her young mind early on, planting seeds of resistance that would one day bloom into fierce defiance. She was a quiet, sharp-eyed student, reserved but determined. At school, Lepa stood out not just for her intelligence, but for her seriousness. She devoured books far beyond her grade level and questioned authority with a quiet boldness. Her teachers noticed she wasn't like the other children. She was watching, thinking, preparing. At just 15, while others her age were preoccupied with chores or childhood games, Lipa joined the League of Communist Youth and the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. The world was at war, and she had already chosen her side. In a world increasingly swallowed by tyranny, Lepa Radic didn't stumble into resistance. She stepped into it with clarity and conviction. Long before she held a rifle, she had armed herself with ideas. In her small village, under the weight of a growing storm, a teenage girl was quietly becoming a symbol of something much greater. By the early 1940s, Europe was ablaze. Adolf Hitler's armies had stormed across the continent like an unstoppable wave, toppling governments and redrawing borders in days. Yet the Balkans remained a defiant, tangled patch on the Nazi map, one Hitler could not afford to ignore. Yugoslavia, nestled in the heart of the Balkans, tried to walk a tightrope of neutrality. But neutrality was a luxury Hitler wouldn't tolerate. In March 1941, the Yugoslav government, under pressure, reluctantly signed the Tripartite Pact, an alliance with the Axis powers. To the outside world, it looked like surrender. But inside the country, anger boiled over. Just 2 days later, the people rose up. A bloodless coup replaced the regime and placed a teenage King Peter II on the throne. It was a slap to Hitler's pride, and he never tolerated defiance. Furious, Hitler issued Führer Directive 25. On April 6, 1941, the skies over Yugoslavia darkened as German bombers roared overhead, launching a brutal invasion. In just 11 days, Yugoslavia crumbled. But what followed was even worse. The Nazis carved up the country, installing puppet regimes like the Ustaše in Croatia, fanatics who unleashed a reign of terror against Serbs, Jews, and Roma. Villages burned. Thousands were slaughtered. The promise of neutrality had turned to ash. Amid this chaos, something extraordinary began to stir. Resistance. From the deep forests and high mountains, partisans rose up. These were not seasoned soldiers, but farmers, students, and children. Among them was a teenage girl named Lepa Radic, watching the fall of her homeland, already resolved to stand and fight. The war in the Balkans wasn't just about land. It was a clash of ideologies, identities, and survival. And for Yugoslavia, the battle had just begun. When Yugoslavia fell under the crushing force of Nazi tanks in April 1941, its pieces were handed out like trophies. Among them, a sinister new puppet state was born, the independent state of Croatia. But what Hitler and Mussolini saw as a strategic victory became, for the people within, a nightmare painted in blood. The regime was handed to the Ustaše, a fascist ultranationalist group led by Ante Pavelić. To the world, they spoke of independence, but to those who lived under their rule, it was nothing short of calculated extermination. The Ustaše didn't just mirror Nazi ideology, they reveled in its cruelty. Their goal, a pure Croatian state, free of Serbs, Jews, and Roma. They promised a horrifying formula: kill 1/3, expel 1/3, and convert the rest. What followed defied humanity. Entire villages were wiped out, families torn apart, people butchered not with bullets, but with knives, axes, and even saws. Children weren't spared. In places like Jasenovac, a camp of horrors rivaling Auschwitz, the air was thick with the stench of death. Lipa Radić village wasn't immune. She witnessed friends disappear, neighbors silenced, and innocents slaughtered. This wasn't just war, it was genocide dressed in uniforms. But in the ashes of fear, resistance began to flicker. For people like Lepa, the enemy was no longer just foreign invaders. It was this homegrown terror. The Ustaše had hoped to scare the people into submission. Instead, they created martyrs, fighters, and a burning will to resist. The independent state of Croatia was built with Nazi support, but its foundation was cruelty. And its legacy would be written not by flags or borders, but by the bravery of those who stood up and said, "No more." As Yugoslavia burned under the boots of Nazi and Ustaše oppression, many chose silence, survival, and surrender. But others, braver, bolder, chose to fight. From deep in the forests and rugged mountains, the partisans emerged. A resistance forged not from military might, but from raw, desperate courage. Led by Josip Broz Tito, the partisans were a patchwork of farmers, factory workers, students, and ex-soldiers. What united them wasn't training, it was rage. Rage against tyranny, against mass graves and burned-out homes, against the sight of neighbors hung in village squares. Among them, one of the youngest was also one of the fiercest, Lepa Radić. Just 16 when she took up arms, Lepa didn't join the fight, she became it. After escaping a prison where she and her family were held for their political beliefs, she didn't flee into hiding. She joined the 7th Partisan Company of the 2nd Krajina Detachment. At first, she served as a nurse, tending to the wounded, but her quiet strength, her clarity of purpose, soon made her a leader. She recruited other youth to the cause. She gathered food under the noses of Nazi patrols. She carried the injured across dangerous terrain, guided only by courage and moonlight. But Lipa wasn't just a helper. She was a fighter. Rifle in hand, she stood beside men twice her age, her resolve unshaken. In every ambush, every mission, she proved what the partisans believed. The will to resist was stronger than the fear of death. The partisans weren't just a resistance, they were a rebellion of the human spirit. And in their ranks, Lepa Radić shone like a torch in the night. A teenage girl, defying the full weight of fascism, one bullet, one act of bravery at a time. Military operations, bravery in the blood and snow. By 1943, the partisan war effort was teetering on the edge of annihilation. Nazi divisions, reinforced by collaborators, launched Case White, a brutal campaign to crush the resistance. In its path stood mountain passes soaked with snow and blood. At the heart of this chaos was a 17-year-old girl named Lepa Radić. Lepa was no longer just a partisan, she was a symbol of survival. When the Battle of Neretva began, one of the largest confrontations between Axis forces and Yugoslav resistance, she didn't retreat. While bullets flew and artillery echoed through the valleys, she moved through the chaos not as a soldier with a weapon, but as a lifeline. Her mission, save the wounded. Again and again, she risked her life dragging injured fighters across freezing rivers, dodging shrapnel, and leading them to shelter hidden deep in the hills near Grmech. The partisan leader, Tito, had made one order clear: no wounded were to be left behind. Lipa made that command her calling. In one moment of daring, she led a grain harvesting mission near German encampments, armed only with resolve and silence. In another, she worked without sleep to evacuate the bleeding and broken from the front lines, knowing that Axis troops executed the wounded without mercy. But even Lepa's iron will had limits. During a mission to save over 100 women and children caught in crossfire, she was captured. Her rifle emptied, her breath heavy, she still stood tall, unbowed. Lipa wasn't just helping others survive. She was proving, with every step through gunfire, that courage doesn't need age or rank. In the freezing grip of war, she became the warmth of humanity and the fire of resistance. The capture, steel in her silence. February 1943. The forests near Germech were silent, blanketed in winter's stillness, until German boots shattered the calm. The 7th SS Volunteer Mountain Division, battle-hardened and ruthless, descended on the region like wolves. In the chaos, Lepa Radic, then just 17, was captured while trying to evacuate over 100 women and children from a village under threat. She had fought until her last bullet. Surrounded, outnumbered, and unarmed, she did not surrender. She resisted. It took a full detachment of SS soldiers to bring down a teenage girl. Even in defeat, she spat defiance. Taken to a Nazi prison in Bosanska Krupa, Lipa faced a fate worse than execution: silence. No name, no rank, no confession. The Nazis tortured her in isolation, starving her, beating her, demanding names of partisan leaders. But all they met was silence, and eyes that did not blink. Her captors were stunned. Here was a girl, bloodied, bruised, and shackled, who refused to break. She bore the agony with the kind of dignity that terrified men with power. Her resistance wasn't just in combat, it was in her refusal to betray. Days passed. The Nazis called her a bandit, but they knew they were witnessing something more dangerous: unshakable belief. Her strength echoed through the prison walls, unsettling even the guards. And when offered a final chance at life, freedom in exchange for names, Lepa replied, "I am not a traitor to my people. Those you seek will show themselves when you are all gone." The Nazis didn't just arrest a partisan, they had captured a symbol, and they realized too late. Some spirits cannot be caged. The execution, death could not silence her. February 8, 1943. The sky over Bosanska Krupa was gray, and the streets unnaturally quiet. Word had spread, the Germans were preparing an execution. Not of a man, not of a soldier, but of a 17-year-old girl. Lepa Radic, bound and bruised, was led through the town square. Her captors tried to parade her like a warning, but instead, people saw something else: a martyr in the making. The gallows was a crude thing, a rope slung over a tree branch, a wooden box beneath it. The Nazis wanted submission. What they got was defiance. Even with a noose around her neck, Lipa stood tall. When the SS officer offered her life in exchange for names of her fellow partisans, she didn't flinch. "I am not a traitor of my people," she declared, voice steady, eyes blazing. "Those you seek will reveal themselves when they have crushed you all." Then she turned to the crowd, her people, and shouted her final cry: "Long live the Communist Party! Long live the partisans! Fight, people, for your freedom! I will be killed, but others will avenge me." There was no fear in her voice, only fire. The officer hesitated. Then, with one swift kick, the box fell away. The rope snapped tight. And in that frozen moment, the Nazis thought they had silenced her. But they were wrong. Lepa Radic did not die that day. She rose. In the hearts of those who watched, she became more than a girl. She became a legend, a symbol of resistance. Proof that even in the face of a monstrous empire, one voice, one soul, could still shake the world. She was just 17, but her courage was eternal. Though Lepa Radic's life was brutally cut short at just 17, Her legacy blazes on like an unquenchable fire, a symbol of fearless resistance and unyielding hope against oppression. After the war, her extraordinary courage was honored by the newly formed Yugoslavian government, who posthumously awarded her the prestigious title of National Hero of Yugoslavia, a rare and sacred recognition reserved for those who showed the highest bravery and sacrifice. Lepa's story transcended her village and country, echoing across generations as a beacon of youthful defiance against one of history's darkest tyrannies. She became more than just a partisan fighter. She became a legend, inspiring countless young people to stand firm in the face of injustice and to fight for freedom no matter the cost. Her name is etched into monuments, schools, and streets, reminding everyone that even the smallest voice can roar loudest when fueled by conviction. Poems, songs, and stories keep her spirit alive, painting her as the fearless teenager who dared to challenge an empire of cruelty and never surrendered. But beyond official honors and memorials, Lepa's true legacy lies in the hearts of those who believe in courage, sacrifice, and the power of standing up for what is right. In a world still scarred by conflict and tyranny, her life calls to us, urging us to remember that bravery knows no age, and that one young girl's defiance can echo through history forever. Lepa Radic's memory is not just a chapter in a history book, it is a living flame, inspiring freedom fighters and dreamers worldwide to rise and resist. A girl born in war, a voice from heaven, a mission that defied kings. Jeanne d'Arc was no princess. She was a peasant, a visionary, a warrior. In a world ruled by men and marked by betrayal, she rose with sword and faith to shape the fate of France. But glory has a price, and for Jeanne, it was fire. This is the story of the martyrdom of Joan of Arc. She was a peasant girl, raised among the hills of Domremy, a village on the border between hope and destruction. France was burning, torn apart by war, betrayal, and foreign powers. But in the heart of an insignificant valley, a girl was growing up who would change the course of history. Her name, Joan. No nobility, no education, barely able to write her own name. But she had something no general possessed: vision. At 13, while working in the garden near the village church, she was overcome by a light so bright it seemed to tear the sky open. In that light stood a figure, powerful, radiant, the Archangel Michael. Soon after, two female figures appeared, ones she recognized from church paintings, Saint Catherine of Alexandria and Saint Margaret of Antioch, young martyrs who chose faith over life. Joan fell to her knees. She trembled with fear, but the voices spoke gently, firmly. God had chosen her, they said. Not a king, not a priest, a girl. Her mission was clear: drive the English from France, lead the army, and ensure the Dauphin, Charles, was crowned at Reims. The command was unbelievable, impossible, and yet she felt it in her bones. She was no dreamer, no child of madness. She had a purpose. For 3 years, she said nothing. She carried their words like a hidden flame in her heart, a fire that would grow into a storm. Because in a time when men listened only to swords, one girl heard something else. She heard a calling. By 1429, France was on the brink. The English, bolstered by their Burgundian allies, had pushed deep into French territory. Orléans, a critical gateway to the heart of France, was under siege. The Dauphin, Charles, clung to his claim, but few believed he would ever be crowned. And then came Jeanne. After months of rejection, she finally secured an audience at Chinon. A teenage peasant girl, dressed in borrowed clothes, claiming a divine mission. Yet when she stood before the Dauphin, she spoke with a conviction that silenced the room. She identified him in disguise, shared secrets no one could have told her, and declared God's will. Charles must be crowned, and she would lead him there. Astonished but desperate, Charles agreed. Jeanne was examined by theologians, interrogated by courtiers. She passed every test, declared devout, pure, and sincere. She was given armor, a sword, and a white banner. On it, the image of Christ, and the words, Jesus Maria. She rode at the head of the army, not as a soldier, but as a symbol. A girl who spoke of angels and marched into battle. At Orléans, the French morale had collapsed. But Jean's arrival changed everything. She moved through the troops like fire through dry grass, rallying them, praying with them, reminding them they fought not just for land, but for salvation. Within days, the English lines began to crumble. She led an assault on Les Tourelles, was struck by an arrow, but returned to the front the very next day. Her courage was contagious. By May, the siege was broken. The Maid of Orléans had delivered her first miracle. She had turned the tide of war. And for the first time in years, France dared to believe. The siege of Orléans had been lifted, but Jean's mission was not yet complete. The voices that guided her were clear. Charles must be crowned at Reims, the ancient seat of French kings. But the path was treacherous. Reims lay deep in enemy territory, surrounded by towns still loyal to the English or the Burgundians. Jean pressed the Dauphin to act. She had become more than a military mascot. She was now a moral force. Emboldened by her conviction and the string of unexpected victories, Charles agreed. The march to Reims became a procession. Town after town opened its gates, choosing to welcome the Maid rather than resist her. Her reputation preceded her. To many, she was a prophet. To others, a divine sign that France had not been forsaken. On July 17, 1429, Charles was crowned King Charles VII of France. In Reims Cathedral, amid incense and chants, the oil of sacred anointing touched his brow. Jean stood by his side, her banner raised higher than any sword. For her, it was the fulfillment of the divine mission entrusted to her by the saints. A farm girl from Domremy had brought a king to his crown, but not all were jubilant. Within Charles's court, murmurs of unease began to stir. Some nobles feared her influence, others resented it. The new king, cautious and politically inclined, began to distance himself. Jeanne felt it. The warmth began to fade, yet she refused to rest. France was still occupied. The English were not gone. Her voices still called. The coronation was a triumph, but it was not the end. Jean's mission was fulfilled in heaven's eyes, but her war on earth had only just begun. With Charles crowned, Jean's divine mission seemed complete, but in her eyes, the work was far from over. France was still fractured, and Paris, the heart of the kingdom, remained in enemy hands. Jean urged the king to strike swiftly, to ride the wave of momentum and reclaim the capital. But Charles hesitated. He had achieved legitimacy, and now he turned to diplomacy. Jean's fiery resolve clashed with the king's cautious court. Her divine conviction, once embraced as salvation, began to unsettle those who feared her growing fame. In September 1429, an assault on Paris was finally attempted. Jean, leading from the front as always, charged the gates. But this time, there was no miracle. She was struck by a crossbow bolt in the thigh and carried from the battlefield. The attack failed, and with it, so too began the decline of Jean's influence. Her military victories had once silenced doubters. Now, her setback gave them voice. Some courtiers whispered of arrogance. Others questioned her visions. The king, once inspired by her, now kept her at arm's length. Still, Jeanne would not retreat. She continued to lead minor campaigns, clinging to the purpose that had driven her from Domremy. But without royal backing, her forces thinned and her victories waned. She was no longer the sacred Maid of Orléans. To some, she had become a nuisance, a holy girl out of time, out of favor, and increasingly alone. The fall had begun not with a betrayal, but with a silence. The silence of a king who turned away, the silence of a court that once cheered, and the silence of God, whose voices she could still hear, though fewer now, and more distant than ever. In May 1430, Jeanne's defiance led her to the fortified town of Compiègne. Still resolute, she was fighting on the front lines when the unthinkable happened. She was thrown from her horse and captured by the Burgundians, French allies of the English. The girl who had once led armies was now a prisoner. Her captors knew her worth. Jeanne was no ordinary soldier. She was a symbol, a miracle to her followers, a menace to her enemies. For months, she languished in prison while negotiations unfolded behind closed doors. The Burgundians, always shrewd, saw an opportunity. And the English, who had long feared her as a witch, a heretic, a threat to their cause, paid for her transfer. She was delivered to Rouen, the heart of English-occupied Normandy. There, surrounded by enemies, she was locked away in a tower, guarded night and day. She wore chains. She was denied comfort, denied counsel. Her visions continued, but her hope began to waver. The greatest silence came not from heaven, but from the king she had crowned. Charles VII, whose throne she had risked her life to secure, made no effort to ransom her. No army marched in her name. No emissary came to plead her case. To the court at Bourges, Jeanne had served her purpose. Her flame, once so vital, now flickered in isolation. She was just 19. In the dungeons of Rouen, the girl who once defied kingdoms waited, not for rescue, not for justice, but for judgment. Her armor was gone, her banner stilled, only her faith remained, and that, too, would be put on trial. Jeanne was dragged before an ecclesiastical court in Rouen, an English stronghold cloaked in the robes of religion. Her charges were grave: heresy, witchcraft, and the unforgivable sin of wearing men's clothing. But beneath the surface, this was not a trial of faith. It was a political execution in disguise. She faced dozens of learned clerics, most of them hostile, all determined to break her spirit. But Jeanne, uneducated and alone, held her ground. She answered with clarity, wit, and unwavering conviction. When asked if she believed her voices came from God, she replied, "How else could I have done what I did?" Day after day, they tried to trap her, twisting her words, baiting her into confession. They scorned her visions, mocked her attire, and pushed her to recant. But Jeanne remained steadfast. She wore male clothing not out of vanity, but for protection. She obeyed the voices not out of madness, but out of faith. Still, the verdict had been written before the trial began. The court needed a heretic, and they would make one. On May 30th, 1431, at just 19 years old, Jeanne was led to the Vieux Marché in Rouen. Bound to a wooden stake, she looked out at the crowd, not with fear, but with serenity. Witnesses said she asked for a cross. A sympathetic soldier handed one to her. She clutched it as the flames rose. Her body was burned 3 times, her ashes thrown into the Seine. No shrine, no grave. They tried to erase her, but they could not silence her story. Because as the smoke faded, something else began. A legend. A girl who heard angels. A warrior who crowned a king. A martyr who would become a saint. Jeanne d'Arc was dead. But Joan of Arc had just begun. Jeanne's death was meant to end her story. Instead, it gave it immortality. For decades, she remained a controversial figure, remembered by some as a heretic, by others as a hero. But among the people of France, her memory burned brightly. Stories of her bravery, her visions, and her sacrifice spread from village to city. She became a symbol, not just of faith, but of resistance, of hope. In 1456, a second trial was ordered by King Charles VII, the same man she had helped crown, and who had done nothing to save her. This time the court declared her innocent. The charges were false. Her execution, a miscarriage of justice. Jeanne's name was cleared, but she was already beyond their reach. Centuries passed. Wars came and went. Monarchies fell. France changed. But Jeanne remained. In 1920, nearly 500 years after her death, the Catholic Church canonized her. The girl from Domremy was now Saint Joan of Arc. Today, her image stands in cathedrals and classrooms. Statues bear her sword. Writers, artists, and filmmakers retell her life. Politicians invoke her courage. She is claimed by feminists, nationalists, believers, and skeptics alike. But beyond the myths and symbols, there was once a real girl, barefoot in a field, hearing voices no one else could hear. A teenager who dared to lead armies, speak with kings, and challenge the world's most powerful institutions. She did not fight for glory. She did not fight for gain. She fought because she believed, and in doing so, she became more than a warrior. She became eternal. Joan of Arc was not a legend rising from the mists of the Middle Ages. She was a real girl, of flesh and blood. Born in a forgotten village, without power, without education, but with unshakable conviction, she dared to believe that one voice, even a female voice in a world of men, could make a difference. Her battle was greater than the wars she fought. She fought against systems that tried to diminish her, against a church that branded her a heretic, against a crown that forgot her. But above all, she fought for her vision, a France free from English rule, led by a rightful king, and blessed by God. That vision took her from the countryside to palaces, from the battlefield to the courtroom, and ultimately to the stake. Her life was short and tragic, but not meaningless. She was humiliated, burned, erased, yet never forgotten. Joan of Arc reminds us that true heroism requires no weapons, only willpower, no crowns, only faith, no permission, only the courage to rise when the world tells you to be silent. Her body turned to ash, but her story became eternal, because as long as injustice exists, Joan will speak, not as a myth, but as a girl who never stayed silent. Remember the 5th of November. Every year in the United Kingdom, Bonfire Night is celebrated with fireworks, bonfires, and festivities. But behind the cheerful spectacle lies a story steeped in religious tension, conspiracy, and brutal retribution. Today, we uncover the forgotten story behind Bonfire Night, the rise and fall of Guy Fawkes and his fellow conspirators. In early 17th century England, religious division ran deep. King James I, a staunch Protestant, ruled a nation that increasingly marginalized its Catholic population. Catholics faced harsh restrictions, barred from public office, fined for not attending Protestant services, and forced to practice their faith in secrecy. Amidst this climate of oppression, a group of 13 devout Catholics, led by Robert Catesby, decided that dramatic action was necessary. Their radical plan was audacious and treasonous: to blow up the Houses of Parliament during the state opening, when King James I, his heir, members of the aristocracy, and church leaders would all be present. This violent act would decapitate the Protestant leadership in one explosive moment. With the monarchy in ruins, they hoped to ignite a rebellion that would usher in a new Catholic regime. A young princess, Elizabeth, daughter of James I, was even earmarked as a puppet queen who would restore Catholicism to England. This conspiracy was not merely political. It was a desperate and dangerous response to years of persecution. It was the Gunpowder Plot, a religiously fueled attempt to change the very fabric of English society through destruction. Guy Fawkes was no ordinary conspirator. Born in York and raised a Catholic during a time of religious persecution, he grew up in a divided and dangerous England. As a young man, he left his homeland to fight for Catholic Spain against Protestant forces in the 80 Years' War. This experience sharpened his resolve and military skill. It was in Flanders that he encountered English Catholics plotting rebellion. When he returned to England, he was recruited by Robert Catesby to join the Gunpowder Plot. His role was crucial. As an explosives expert, he was tasked with guarding the 36 barrels of gunpowder secretly stored beneath the House of Lords. The plan was meticulous and timed to detonate during the state opening of Parliament. In the early hours of November 5, 1605, a search party discovered Fawkes in the cellar. He was dressed in riding gear, carrying matches and a slow-burning fuse, ready to flee on horseback. When arrested, he boldly gave the alias John Johnson. Calm and defiant, he made no apologies for his actions. In that moment, Guy Fawkes became the infamous face of England's most notorious failed rebellion. Immediately after his arrest, Guy Fawkes was brought before members of King James I's Privy Chamber. The mood was tense, the questions probing. Who was he? Who were his accomplices? What was the full extent of the plot? Yet Fawkes, adopting the alias John Johnson, stayed silent. Calm and composed, he refused to give up any names or betray his fellow conspirators. He admitted to his intentions and showed no remorse, but kept the details of the plot close to his chest. His cool demeanor and unshaken resolve even earned a grudging admiration from King James I himself, who noted his Roman resolution. But admiration was not enough to spare him. The stakes were too high, the threat too severe. With the country on edge and demands for justice growing, James authorized the use of torture to extract the truth. A royal warrant was issued, allowing for the gradual application of torment, starting with lighter methods and escalating to the most severe. It marked a dark turning point. What had begun as a political investigation would soon descend into a physical and psychological battle between the will of one man and the might of the English crown. Guy Fawkes was transferred to the Tower of London, a place infamous for centuries of pain and punishment. The tower loomed not only as a fortress, but as a warning to enemies of the crown. Once inside, Fawkes was subjected to methods meant to erode both body and spirit. Initially, he was suspended by manacles, iron restraints that hung him by the wrists for hours. The agony was immediate and excruciating, dislocating joints and tearing tendons. Yet Fawkes remained silent, enduring the torment with remarkable resolve. When that failed, authorities escalated to the rack, the most feared device in the tower. Fawkes was strapped down, his limbs slowly stretched in opposite directions. Muscles tore, joints popped from their sockets, and pain surged through his body like fire. Each crank of the mechanism broke him down further, physically and mentally. Yet even through this unbearable suffering, he clung to silence for days. His captors were astonished, but eventually, no man, no matter how brave, could resist indefinitely. The strength that had made Guy Fawkes a soldier and rebel finally gave way. His body broken and spirit worn thin, he reached the brink. The torture had succeeded. The silence was ending. As the torture broke his body and spirit, Guy Fawkes could no longer hold out. The silence that had shielded his co-conspirators shattered. One by one, names were extracted, and the grand conspiracy began to unravel. Authorities launched a sweeping crackdown. Some of the plotters were captured and thrown into prison. Others met a bloody end resisting arrest. Their clandestine meetings, secret oaths, and months of planning, all laid bare by a man who had once vowed never to speak. The revelation sent shockwaves through the kingdom. Not only had they planned to kill the king and his court, but they also aimed to spark a national uprising. Even more startling was their plan to place Princess Elizabeth, the 9-year-old daughter of King James, on the throne as a Catholic figurehead. She was to be raised by loyal Catholic nobles and molded into a monarch who would restore their faith to prominence. But these ambitions were not to be. With the details of the plot exposed, the government moved quickly to extinguish any remaining threats. The conspirators' dream of revolution died with their confessions, buried beneath the weight of their failure and the fury of the crown. After weeks of investigation and confession, the surviving conspirators were brought to trial in January 1606. The outcome was never in doubt. Charged with high treason, the gravest offense against the crown, they faced a court that was both judge and executioner. The evidence was overwhelming. Testimonies, seized letters, and most damning of all, Guy Fawkes's tortured confession. The verdict was swift. They were all found guilty. Their punishment was designed to be both excruciating and symbolic. First, they were to be dragged through the streets of London behind horses, a humiliating prelude to their fate. At the gallows, each man would be hanged until barely alive, then disemboweled while conscious. Their entrails were burned before their eyes. Finally, they would be beheaded and quartered, their limbs and heads displayed on spikes across the kingdom as a grim deterrent to would-be traitors. The spectacle was intended to reinforce the absolute power of the monarchy and the ruthless consequences of rebellion. It sent a clear message. Treason would not just be punished, it would be annihilated. The executions marked the brutal final chapter in the story of the Gunpowder Plot, forever seared into England's memory. On January 31st, 1606, Guy Fawkes was brought from the Tower of London to Old Palace Yard, the very site of his intended destruction. Frail, tortured, and barely able to stand, he was forced to face the ultimate humiliation, a public execution before the people and government he had tried to destroy. The crowd gathered, eager to witness the final punishment of England's most infamous traitor. Fawkes, supported by guards, made his way to the gallows. Though physically broken, his mind remained defiant. He was the last of the condemned to ascend the scaffold. As the noose was placed around his neck, he looked out one final time. Then, in a dramatic final act of control, he leapt from the ladder. The fall snapped his neck instantly. Death came swiftly, sparing him the unspeakable agony of disembowelment and quartering while still conscious, the horrific fate that had awaited him. Though he escaped the torment in life, his corpse was not spared. As decreed by law, Fox's body was mutilated, dismembered, and distributed across the kingdom. His end was brutal, but it cemented his legacy, not just as a conspirator, but as a symbol of resistance and defiance. Every year on November 5th, the skies of Britain explode with fireworks and the scent of bonfires fills the air. Children craft effigies of Guy Fawkes, tossing them into the flames as crowds cheer. But beyond the festivity lies a far more complex story. Are we celebrating the failure of an uprising, the protection of the monarchy, or something darker, the brutal silencing of dissent? The gunpowder plot's legacy is one of contradiction. To some, it's a story of justice delivered. To others, it's a symbol of religious persecution and authoritarian power. Guy Fawkes, once a villain, has been reinterpreted over time, morphing from a failed terrorist to a symbol of resistance and rebellion against tyranny. His image, immortalized by the iconic mask, now represents protest movements worldwide. Bonfire Night serves as a national ritual, a collective memory that has evolved far beyond its violent origins. It reflects a society's complex relationship with power, resistance, and remembrance. The flames may burn effigies, but they also keep alive a centuries-old debate. Perhaps what we truly commemorate isn't Fawkes's failure, but the enduring human spirit to challenge authority, no matter the cost. Today, Guy Fawkes's face is instantly recognizable, not because of portraits or history books, but because of a stylized mask, the one made famous by the graphic novel and film V for Vendetta. This mask has become an emblem of rebellion, worn by activists from Occupy Wall Street to Anonymous. It's a curious transformation. The image of a failed 17th century conspirator now represents modern resistance against oppression. But who was Guy Fawkes, really? Was he a villain seeking mass murder, or a freedom fighter responding to persecution? To the authorities of his time, he was a terrorist bent on overthrowing the government through violence. Yet to others, then and now, he's seen as a martyr for religious freedom, a man who dared to strike back at systemic injustice. This dual identity, traitor or hero, has fueled his myth. Over time, public memory has blurred the lines between fact and folklore. Guy Fawkes has evolved from historical figure into symbol, and that symbol now lives beyond the context of the gunpowder plot. In today's world, his legacy is a mirror reflecting our ongoing struggles with power, justice, and the right to defy. What if the explosion had succeeded? What if the king, his family, and the entire government had been obliterated in a single earth-shaking blast? The impact would have been immediate and irreversible. England, at the height of political and religious tension, might have descended into chaos. With the monarchy in ruins and the Protestant power structure decapitated, civil war could have erupted. Catholic factions may have seized the opportunity to reassert control, possibly installing Princess Elizabeth as a Catholic queen under their guidance. The ripple effects would have reached far beyond England's borders. A successful assassination of a monarch through terrorism would have sent shockwaves through Europe. Other kingdoms might have tightened their own security or responded with fear and repression. The religious conflicts that already plagued the continent could have been intensified, and England might have rejoined Catholic alliances rather than forging its own Protestant identity. Such a turning point in history would have altered the trajectory of British politics, religion, and global influence. The gunpowder plot, had it succeeded, could have transformed the nation into something unrecognizable. In the end, it remains one of history's most chilling and thought-provoking what-if scenarios. A reminder of how close the world came to a radically different future.